All right. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Britta Dornfeld. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior partnership manager with Environmental Initiative. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for the Sustainable Procurement Learning Lab, which is being put on by the Sustainable Growth Coalition, a program area of environmental initiative that I co-lead with Tonya Drawn. To get us started, I would like to acknowledge that we are convening this space from Minnesota, which is the homeland of the Dakota people, and where Dakota and Anishinaabe people, as well as Indigenous people from other tribal nations currently reside. I'd love for each of you to let us know in the chat where you're calling from and the native land you're on, as well as who you are if you haven't introduced yourself. If you don't know the native land you're on, please use the link in the chat to look it up. So, today, you'll get the chance to hear from our speakers for about 35 minutes, and then we have about 15 minutes left on the agenda for a Q&A with them, so lots of time for Q&A, hopefully. If you have questions during the panel discussion, please drop them into the chat, and my colleague Rachel will monitor those for the Q&A. I'd like to now take a moment to thank our presenters, Olivia Fritz and Jon Smieja, for being with me here today. Olivia Fritz is the Director of Operations and co-founder of TrueNorth Collective, and she has a decade-long history in shaping sustainability strategy for global manufacturers. Having led Kohler's transparency at scale efforts and material health integration into design for environment programming, she now advises companies on product sustainability strategy through design for sustainability. Her experience in engineering, compliance, and business drives her mission to move sustainability from the sidelines to the mainstream norm. Some of you may recognize Jon Smieja. He is the Vice President of Circularity and a Senior Analyst at GreenBiz Group, a media and events company that works to accelerate the just transition to a clean economy. Previously, Jon served as the Corporate Sustainability Manager for Andersen Windows and Doors and was responsible for product lifecycle assessments, material ingredient transparency, and preparing Andersen for a future in the circular economy. That time, he was also, very thankfully and gratefully, a steering committee member of the Sustainable Growth Coalition. He earned his BS in chemistry from the University of St. Thomas and a PhD in inorganic chemistry from the University of California, San Diego. I'm so excited to have these two with us today to discuss the important topic of sustainable procurement. And so we are going to get right into it. And my first question to you both is, what would you say is the most important thing to keep in mind when working on sustainable procurement?
I can get started. Thank you, Britta. So this one, I think there's so much going on in this space right now, especially as many of the regulations are driving companies to think more about this, which we'll talk about in a bit with another question. But when I think about sustainable procurement and how to best go about that, one of the things I like to encourage folks to think about is that procurement is just one part of the life cycle of and one function within the design of, if we're thinking about a product or a service. And so thinking about procurement is not being done inside a box, but thinking about how you collaborate with others to consider what suppliers you're selecting, how you're sourcing, and how you can work together. So I think one example of this that I have from working in product development at Kohler is we identified some specific materials or chemicals of concern that weren't necessarily regulated yet, but we could see that coming down the pike. And we noticed that some of the hardware components that were being sourced from suppliers had this coating on them that we wanted to consider removing. And so that was something that procurement probably wouldn't be that in tune with that very specific chemical of concern on that one component, but because that component was used across so many different products and across the category, by bringing that conversation up in product development and kind of collaborating with procurement, there was an understanding that, hey, let's at least talk to the supplier of this hardware component about the ability to remove this chemical of concern. And actually, it was much, typically that can be hard, but it was much easier than we thought, because the supplier actually mentioned, hey, all of our other customers actually ask us to do that as well. But we have, like, I think they had 2 manufacturing lines, and one maybe still used that chemical and one did not. There was no cost change, which might be uncommon in this situation, but there was actually no cost change, and they were able to transition to using this, same hardware component, but to remove that coating, or they replaced it with the one that was typically seen as more environmentally favorable than the alternative. And so that was where, like, procurement probably wouldn't be as focused on that specific chemical, but through collaborating and thinking about identification of that chemical of concern, that was a huge change, especially with the amount of components that were purchased from that supplier. And so really bring multiple different stakeholders together to have conversations and identify areas of improvement, I think, is really important, versus kind of the procurement group thinking they're, it's only just their job to kind of figure out how to incorporate sustainability within supplier selection.
Love that. I will add, so I'm gonna break the rules already, but I have 2 things here. So one, I think it's really important, the organizations I have connected with, worked at, that have been most successful in this space have actually added a scorecard for suppliers on sustainability. A lot of organizations, as we know, have scorecards around quality, on-time delivery, you name it, right? They might have a lot of scorecards that they're rating their suppliers on. Adding a sustainability component to that scoring, whether it's around embodied carbon, chemicals of concern, potential for circularity of that material, I think that's important, and I think it should be included in every supplier scorecard. And those metrics then can help guide you towards potentially your current hotspots or places for improvement within your supply chain, just by knowing how your current supply chain is faring on this metric, this scorecard. The second one I would point out is that a lot of big companies, I think, are too allergic to, too scared of working with innovators that are still small scale. And this is obviously not an easy thing to do, to work with a supplier that is small through their scale up, through testing, et cetera. But I think you might have to take a longer view approach of how to work with innovative small companies in sourcing, to really, to really make a dent, whether it's carbon, circular economy metrics, et cetera. And I think one way to do that is to maybe invest in the companies that you're interested in, so you've got a stake in the game, or just agree on testing and scale up, with certain caveats around performance of that supplier. I think those are really important things to do, because there's a lot of really interesting innovators out there that are working on low carbon, fully recyclable, reusable materials that are having trouble scaling.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I feel like this covers a lot of what we're thinking about, but then also getting a little more specific. What's one best practice for sustainable procurement that you wish was more commonly discussed?
I think I actually recognize a couple people on this call, and you will be familiar with this, but life cycle assessment and the integration of life cycle thinking and systems thinking in sustainable procurement is a best practice. And if you haven't heard of life cycle assessment, it's really taking data about the inputs to a system, whether that's a manufacturing facility or a whole organization or a product specifically. There's different scopes you could look at, taking all the inputs and outputs, and then understanding the environmental impact through carbon, water scarcity metrics, waste, human toxicity. So there's a variety of different impact categories to look at. But what we see this being used a lot in companies is to do comparisons. So when you're looking at your supply chain and you're looking at suppliers and where your impact is, and you're considering maybe technology changes or material changes, any kind of design change or decision that you might be looking at, if you want to understand the trade-offs and the potential improvement, using life cycle assessment, even at a screening level. There's third-party verifications you can get if you want to take it all the way to a marketing claim, but you can still do a screening level or use even Excel-based input-output tool to, at a high level, understand trade-offs in decision-making using life cycle assessment principles. So, just like John, you were saying, it's sustainability, is one piece that you might be adding to a supplier scorecard. And when you're making a decision in, say, product development, just like the cost or quality or time to market, all these other factors that we're looking at, sustainability is not the only piece, but using life cycle assessment is really helpful to understand that. And one thing I've seen companies do is a larger kind of enterprise level LCA that's a bit higher level than you would do, but it really helps to understand the hot spots in your your whole organization, but specifically drilling into supply chain even further, so that when you're looking at a really long and large supply chain and supplier network, you can help to focus on the ones that make the most impact, or the materials or components that are most impactful, and not only look at the ones that are most impactful, but also your ability to change. So kind of that overlap of what do we know is maybe something that we can't change, so we're not going to look at that, and overlay that with the areas of opportunity. And that really helps to, I think, make teams feel like confident in being able to move forward with some either low-hanging fruit areas of opportunity, or a strategy to move forward, because it can feel very overwhelming, especially with how large and long supply chains are for many of our clients, that it's just hard to know where to get started. And they also have so many other things they're focused on day to day with their work. So helping to use tools, LCA is just one, but I think it's a very powerful tool. And when I've been in conversations with some in procurement, that's not a common term or tool that's known always. So that's something I wanted to point out. If you haven't heard of that, if you're interested in learning more, happy to talk more about that in detail. But that's one tool I wanted to make sure that folks were aware of when working in this space.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I think the screening LCA point is really important, because too often companies will only do LCAs on whole products so that they can publish something like a well, now I'm blanking on what the thing is called.
EPD, yeah.
There you go, an environmental product declaration. It's been too long. But I think those screening EPDs or screening LCAs, the fast ones that you can use in product development to compare materials, can be really impactful as well. I was going to say, one of the things that I think we don't employ enough in the sustainability space is linking sustainability initiatives to other initiatives at the company. And one in particular, when it comes to sourcing, that I find useful is looking at future risk. So does the current material palette, the sourcing map, the supplier mix that you're using, does it open you up to things like future climate litigation, chemicals of concern litigation, or things like California Prop 65 lawsuits? Is there sort of an undue potential for sourcing disruptions because of where and how you're sourcing materials? That could be fires in Northern California or hurricanes in the Gulf, right? Like, I think looking at where all your suppliers are making the materials that they're sending to you, how they're sourcing them, I think that can be a joint exploration with your corporate risk team to really see what kind of risks you currently have. And then on the flip side of that, on the flip side of risk, is really, does your current sourcing practices open you up for all the potential benefits that you could have? So I'm thinking of things like, and I don't know all of these obviously, but if you're making things like batteries or electronics, are you taking advantage of the sourcing practices that are written out in the Inflation Reduction Act credits? Like, are you sourcing in a way that you can benefit from all the sustainability and government sort of financial incentives for sort of cleaner sourcing, sourced in America, all those kind of things? So I think there's both sides of this, right? Are you benefiting and are you putting yourself in undue risk with your current supply chain? And I don't think that sustainability is often measured when it comes to supply chain risk yet, and it should be.
And just one point to add on there, John, you talk about the risk, and then I think there's also a lot just on the marketing side of companies wanting to message and communicate the great things they are doing, and the data, such as through life cycle assessment, can help with that and create that benefit. But right now, there's a lot of risk out there just because there's not always enough, like an EPD, to support and back up what claims folks are wanting to make. And so, yeah, even connecting it through, like, what are we doing in procurement that's going to affect how we might want to market this product? And are we having that supporting evidence throughout to actually show that this is we're moving in a more sustainable manner, and that it kind of aligns with where we want to take the business and how we want to communicate on the product too.
For sure.
Yeah, and I think, John, to kind of connect to a few things you were talking about too, about potential benefits from the government and also risks coming down the line, what is the current state of play with policies and regulations around sustainable procurement, and kind of what policies and regulations do you see upcoming around this?
Yeah, so there's a few we wanted to call out, and one particularly, like Buy Clean California Act, if you've heard of that before. There's also now been in December of 2023, the U.S. General Service Administration kind of tied into that to advance what the California Buy Clean Act did to actually more of the federal level for Inflation Reduction Act projects. So, we see California driving regulations around sustainability in other areas in many ways. That's one of them, and particularly with concrete, steel, and asphalt. I see Jeff in the chat mentioned, more about EPDs, and with what the Buy Clean California Act is doing, it's looking at embodied carbon for those three product categories, and they're expanding to more. And then for especially federal or government buildings, they're putting minimum limits on or maximum limits on the embodied carbon. And so, when you're purchasing and procuring those building materials, because sustainability in the building industry is so important, and they're pretty far along in terms of understanding impacts, then architects, designers, specifiers, building owners are looking at when they're procuring these products, they're looking at the transparency documents, EPDs being the primary document that they're looking at for embodied carbon, making sure that's third-party verified. And so then that in the building products industry, others that are not in those main material sets are thinking about, how is that going to affect me moving forward? I should start to understand what my impacts are. And right now it's, can be understanding impacts, but then now it's actually going to comparing impacts and setting maximum limits. And then over time, it's going to be reducing and improving on those impacts as well. So the whole point is to first measure and then manage that and optimize and reduce. So I think we're seeing a lot of our clients, they see what's happening for other like main building material categories, and they're knowing that we're going to have to get prepared because this will be likely coming to us over time. And even if it's not federally mandated, there's still building products that want to compare and to optimize and are using tools right now to do that. So there's a lot of kind of technical questions and details you can get into there, but that's, Buy Clean California and what the GSA is doing, just how much money is kind of coming from the Inflation Reduction Act also to help companies improve their transparency is really driving a lot of this. As well as, I would say, with California's SB 253, which is around scope 1 through 3 measurement and reporting for companies of a specific revenue, and also their enforcement of climate-related financial risk reporting. You just see more companies that are starting to get a better understanding around where their areas of concern are, what their impacts are. And if you have companies that have a lot of their impact in their supply chain, that's they're going to be starting to look there for opportunities to improve and set strategy around. So while it's not directly affecting them to set goals around that, indirectly, once you start understanding where impacts are coming from, if it really is in scope 3, then that will affect you. Or if you're in someone else's scope 3, they're going to be surveying you and requesting support. So California is really leading the way there, and SEC came out with their final ruling, which wasn't as focused on scope 3. So I think California is really leading the way there. That's kind of just a start from things. But Jon, what would you add?
Yeah, well, I think Jeff and Brett are both reading my mind. I was going to mention extended producer responsibility. We're seeing a sort of, you might even call it like an explosion of extended producer responsibility laws around the globe, right? So Europe, a lot of the countries and regions in Europe have had really strong packaging EPR laws for a long time now. We now have Colorado, Oregon, Maine, California, and of course, hot off the press, Minnesota with packaging EPR going into effect here in the US, as well as I think New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts could potentially still pass EPR bills this year. Most of this extended producer responsibility is in packaging, but we're also starting to see some pop up in Europe around things like technology, fashion. There's also some various laws, and I'm not an expert on these, so you'd have to do some research, but on imports and exports of certain types of material throughout Europe and in and out of Europe that are related to sustainability impacts that could impact a lot of businesses soon. So I would say the one way that this is going to likely change supply chains, that was a lot of caveats, sorry. It's almost certainly going to change supply chains to have all this extended producer responsibility, because especially the food and bev sort of consumer packaged goods industries are going to have to think hard about things like recycled content, making their package more recyclable, reuse and refill methods, because ultimately, they're going to be paying the costs, and as a result, we're probably going to be paying the costs for some of their single-use plastics packaging that they're putting out into the market now. I know there's probably a lot of interest in Minnesota's EPR bill, given where most of us are sitting. The text is it's a little bit of a mix of some of the other EPR bills that have been passed in the US. It defines producers as brands, packaging manufacturers, or distributors. It kind of depends on the scenario. And it only exempts a few things like virgin wood fiber, packaging used in infant formula. There's a few exemptions. It also doesn't specify performance targets, which will be interesting as we get into the needs assessment phase of the extended producer responsibility. I think actually a session like this on extended producer responsibility may be valuable with somebody who's an expert. The one thing that everyone should know, though, is the implementation timeline is fairly long, right? They're going to appoint a producer responsibility organization. I think by January 1st is the deadline. That will almost certainly be the Circular Action Alliance, who is the PRO in several of the other states already. And then producers start to register with that PRO throughout 2025 and 2026. And really the targets and the payments don't go into effect until I think 2029. So we've got some time, so don't panic if you're a producer of packaging or single-use sort of consumer packaged goods. You've got some time to understand this, but it's probably valuable to start looking into it now.
Great, thank you. And kind of a little bit on this as well, what are some of the largest challenges that you've been seeing while working with suppliers on sustainable procurement?
I'll start on this one because Olivia said to start on the first three. I have experienced this firsthand and also heard a lot of it in my new role. My role now is working with the largest companies across the globe through our peer network and our events. So I get a lot of good insights from speaking to them. I think one of the biggest things that we see is that companies do not use the leverage that they have on suppliers towards sustainability goals. They might use leverage for cost and for on-time deliveries and for quality concerns. But I think there's a big opportunity to then say, listen, we are buying your product. The people that are buying our products care about sustainability, and so that we need to work together to improve, whether that's the operations of your supplier to lower scope 3 emissions, whether it's the actual materials or chemicals they're using. Olivia had a great example earlier. This type of example of removing chemicals of concern is something that I think is ripe for a little bit more collaboration between manufacturers and their supply chain. I just think that there's a lot more power that big purchasers have in sourcing relationships that they don't really use at the moment. Maybe a good example of where this is happening is in the auto industry, right? They've got their, I don't know what IMDb stands for, I always forget, but their database where all their suppliers have to submit information on their parts and products. They have come together as an industry to say this is going to be the requirement of our supply chain to provide this information so that we can do these assessments. And sustainability and chemicals are only one part of that, but it is a part of it. So I think that's my biggest thing, is that we just don't focus enough on it with our suppliers. And the questions always tend to be, oh, would you please work with us on this? Not, you need to work with us on this, or we're going to find a new supplier for this part. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there in leveraging.
I would add that with the suppliers that I've worked with, and even with my time at Kohler managing a lot of the requests that we were getting in, there are a lot of different surveys and types of questions and needs coming at companies right now. And so it's very burdensome, because they're trying to figure out, okay, who is the best person to respond to this? How many different people have to collaborate? Are these questions even in line with our own sustainability goals, even if they are very far along? So that's very difficult when you have kind of differing perspectives of what sustainability means, or what they're asking of you, what best practice is, and it's not standardized. I think some industries are starting to standardize more and coming together collectively to say, okay, in general, what are the best practices in technology or materials or things that we know like can be improved, and we want to like work towards specifying those. But the burden, there's a lot of burden on suppliers right now, because while they want to improve and be able to do better, they're stuck responding to requests that are being asked of them. And that can be very difficult. So, I have one example that I like to share, that from a large hotel chain. While I was at Kohler, we got a massive request, and they were engaged with a consultant to help evaluate all of their suppliers that they would be used going forward. And in that survey, like, we had a very strong program, and we responded, and we had a lot of people engaged. But ultimately, it was interesting because a lot of the way that questions were being asked did not really align with how we were thinking about like design for sustainability and inclusion of sustainability into business decision-making processes. And it was interesting because the scoring, maybe didn't come out in the way that we thought it should have. And so we engaged in a conversation with them about that, and were able to talk more about the value that we provided beyond just the survey responses, which I think was very helpful. So getting at that, opening up the conversation, opening up the dialogue, and also when maybe someone's not scoring well, and Jon, you're saying like they don't exert the leverage when they're not scoring well, maybe how do you help them to actually move along that path and work together? Because your suppliers may know a lot more about what sustainability really means for them compared to you, or vice versa. But working together and considering design for sustainability principles when moving along that path of maturity, I think is really important. And also then signaling that you're going, if they are collaborating with you and spending, investing money and time and resources, that you are going to kind of stick with them. Because I think there's a big concern, like you're saying, Jon, where we see all of these responses, but then other stakeholders are not seeing it change anything. And so if it's not changing anything, how are they going to continue to want to invest in that and show the benefit? So those are a few thoughts I would add from the, several challenges that we do see with trying to kind of keep up and manage expectations from customers.
I'll just add briefly, Olivia, in my first role in corporate sustainability at Steelcase, most of our customers were really large global enterprises that were sourcing furniture for their spaces. And so we were a supplier to them in that case and got a lot of these surveys. And the point about trying to coalesce around a single survey or at least the same questions being asked is really, really important. It goes back to the IMDb conversation, right? All the auto manufacturers sort of choose from a standard menu of questions that they ask their suppliers. This is a really big opportunity for pre-competitive collaboration within industries to try to figure out what questions are important to your industry to ask your suppliers. So when they are answering these surveys, they're getting the same thing over and over again instead of having to start from scratch every single time, because it's frustrating when you're on the ad end of it. I can say that for sure.
Great. Well, I'm going to pivot a little bit, but I think some of this will also kind of tie back into especially your answers about working together with your suppliers, Olivia, and not just having those conversations. What ways does sustainable procurement also play into equity?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And there's a couple ways that I think of, actually, let me say 3. The first is that, if you are, as a company, going to establish a sort of, whether it's a DEI sourcing or equitable sourcing sort of practice within your business, one really interesting place to start is in your sort of indirect supply chain, right? The whether it's the supplies, the services that you get at your headquarters, the food, et cetera, because those things tend to change a little bit more frequently than your actual part and material suppliers. Anyway, there's more opportunity to work local, and so really looking for ways to sort of equitably source within your own community for those indirect spend opportunities, I think, is a good place to start while you're sort of figuring out if there are opportunities in your core supply chain, your direct materials supply chain, to make improvements. So I think that's number one. Number two, I would say, is this kind of goes back to the risk conversation and knowing where your suppliers are manufacturing and sourcing materials, right? So there's laws around this, like the conflict minerals regulation, to make sure that you're not sourcing from the Congo in a war zone. But this could also extend to, if you're purchasing chemicals or materials that are made in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, or around Sarnia, Canada, where a lot of the chemical manufacturing is happening. Those are places where you can increase equity by saying, listen, I don't want to support industry that is, for lack of a less blunt way to put it, poisoning the people that they're next to. So there's opportunities there too within the risk calculation to say, where are these materials coming from? Are the manufacturers good neighbors, good stewards of the environment? And if not, how can I move away from that? And then I had a third one, and I blanked as I was talking, so I'll turn it over to Olivia, and if it comes up, say it.
I think you had been talking before about working with suppliers so that they can, push it out to their supply chain.
Oh, yeah. That was my third point. I love that. Not only looking at your first tier of suppliers, but also further upstream. Are there suppliers further upstream that you can work with, or that are already have good equity and diversity practices, things like that? I think there's opportunity to extend all of these practices, not only this one, but every other practice we've talked about, up your supply chain or down your supply chain for that matter. So thanks, Olivia, for reminding me.
Yeah, no problem. I just have a few things to add, because I would say I work a bit more focused on the environmental space than the social, but as far, I think a lot about, for example, like a water metric and how that's transitioned over time. So in the past, we used to focus on water use as the main metric to look at water in sustainability. And now it's transitioned to water scarcity. And the reason that is because we know, like, when we're working with either suppliers or manufacturing in areas that have a lot more risk around water, and say we're a water heavy manufacturing process, then it's going to impact the local community a lot more. Maybe where we're draining their aquifers, and then that plays into, you know, how the local community is being affected by these industrial sites and manufacturing facilities. So there's definitely an overlap there. I think we're more and more trying to figure out how to tie in both environmental and social metrics together, because they certainly do overlap, but there's a lot of work going on to figure that out. And thinking too, just about those that are usually most affected from climate change happen to be those that have the least amount of impact. Just thinking about climate refugees, for example, and what's happening just in general as we see, you know, more impacts from climate change. So there certainly can be more work done around how to understand that and measure over time. But I think, you know, echo a lot of what you mentioned, Jon.
Yeah. And so speaking of measuring, what sorts of tools do you recommend to use when you're starting out or expanding your sustainable procurement work?
I had mentioned life cycle assessment before as something that I think I would hope is more talked about in this space. So that would be something definitely to take a look at and start to understand how it can be utilized, especially, like I said, if you're struggling with how to get started, or you need another way to look at what your areas of opportunity are. Doing a enterprise level life cycle assessment to identify hotspots and even drill into specific areas of your supply chain can be really helpful and beneficial, and then do those comparisons as you consider alternatives. So for example, we've seen a lot of our clients want to move from hexchrome to trichrome in their supply chain, and look at that, or lead reduction, or we've also seen clients moving from solvent-based paints to water-based paints. And those are all of those are really great examples of things that are pretty well known that are, you know, better from an environmental impact perspective. But there might be other things you're looking at that are not the case. So life cycle assessment can help to understand those from a data-driven perspective, so that it's not just about, like, what do we think is better? And of course, there's multiple different impact categories to look at too. So understanding trade-offs is really important. We have seen some examples where companies are really focused on carbon only, but then they neglect to think about the material health concerns or water scarcity. And when you aren't looking holistically from multiple different impact categories throughout that life cycle, that can be a concern. Also, again, pointing to the fact of systems thinking. If you're making a change in your supply chain that then affects maybe the use of your product or some other impact or some other life cycle stage, you may be having blinders on for how that affects other areas. So just in general, life cycle assessment and that type of thinking is really helpful. And we tie in design for sustainability with that. So how do you take, you know, kind of data, and then also probing questions to kind of generate creativity around what other options can be, how you work with your supply chain, and how you can you know, work with other functions too. So design for sustainability principles and tools are, you know, out there to support expanding your procurement work in this space, and thinking about that further beyond just kind of a survey, and you know, how do you go from there?
Yeah, that covered a lot of it for me. I think one thing you brought up, Olivia, the sort of carbon tunnel vision that people can get can be a challenge, right? We're all very worried about climate, and carbon is very important, but I think we have to keep our eyes on other impacts. The one that comes up a lot, right, is this sort of, there's sometimes tension between looking only at carbon or looking at sort of next use circular economy sort of factors, right? Because a lot of times when you're just looking at carbon or just looking at a simple LCA, the plastic option, the PVC option, or whatever might look the best, but you have to sort of think about the gaps there, and that's, you know, that tends to be one of the challenges folks have with looking at their LCAs is like, what does this mean for the end of use for my product or my material, or the next use? So I think that's important. The other thing I would mention, there are tools out there, right? So the one that I'm most familiar with is the Salesforce Net Zero Cloud, where you can bring in a lot of your supply chain data around how much of a material you're buying, you know, where it's coming from, et cetera, and start to get an idea of where those hotspots are. Just a simple sort of input output LCA on your whole company will probably, depending on your industry, will probably verify a lot of your thoughts about what the hotspots are. Right? I used to work for a window company. No surprise, the big hotspot is glass. There's a lot of natural gas burned when you're making glass. So at the same time, it's also a really hard one to do anything about. So this gets back to what you mentioned, Olivia, earlier, about looking at not only what the hotspot is, but also your ability to influence the impact in that space. So I think, you know, long story short, I think if you're starting really thinking about how you're going to get data from your supply chain to do, whether it's LCA, hotspot screening, a materiality assessment, et cetera, how do you get that data? Where do you put it? I would not recommend spreadsheets. And then, you know, there are gaps that still exist, right? For example, we don't really have good indicators or ways to measure circularity. And that could be, it could align with our LCA impacts. It could be slightly different. So, you know, figuring out how to measure those in your own company might be a one-off exercise for the time being, because we don't have a real good tool to measure things like that. So.
Great. Well, I feel like you all actually ended up answering a lot of the questions that we had prepped for the rest of this. So I know that there were some questions kind of starting in the chat as well. And so I am going to wrap up kind of this Q&A portion and move into a Q&A portion with the audience instead. And so one of the first questions I'm seeing that we didn't end up getting answered in this is, are strategic road mapping and risk assessment used as tools in sustainable sourcing?
Good question. I would say, yeah, like, yes, like companies I'm seeing are putting in understanding around their supply chain and where they want to head into their strategic plans. So if they, especially if they know they want to like reduce, like they have a specific action, so like lead reduction or different chemicals of concern, or if they want to generally move their suppliers towards more renewable forms of energy or towards certain technology changes, those are going to have to go into their roadmaps, because they know their suppliers cannot just, you know, flip a switch and then it's all changed. And so that's where that collaboration and also signaling to your suppliers that you are starting on this journey and that you're giving them time. So just like with many other regulations, you know, it's not going to happen overnight. There's going to be 5-10 years for you to get ready. And so that's the same thing with this. If you want to really be a partner with your suppliers, helping to signal to them that you're moving in this direction, that you want them to come with you, and what type of things you're looking for. So that definitely can be a roadmap exercise where you're looking 5-10 years down the line on things that you already have identified. And risk assessment, I see the same way, because especially with like chemicals of concern and with all of the regs around enterprise level reporting for environmental impacts, definitely, like Jon, you were mentioning, it's a risk concern. We see a lot of clients that have never maybe considered sustainability because maybe it wasn't something that culturally they were thinking about before. Now they recognize it may become a risk, and so it's becoming more of a push, I guess, for them to consider how to integrate sustainability into their business structure. What would you add,
I would
Jon?
add, yeah, I think that the sort of strategic road mapping, especially, it's only good as a tool for sustainable sourcing if it's part of what your corporate leadership and people within your companies are actually going to be measured on, right? So is it part of their, their performance metrics that we're going to be better on, sourcing topics X, Y, and Z, one of those being sustainability? If that's not part of what people are going to be measured on, then it's not going to function very well as a tool, I don't think. And we've seen this with countless companies, right, where they might set goals, but if no one's actually having their feet held to the fire on those goals, they're almost certainly not going to make them. And we've seen some interesting developments in this space recently, right? Some of you may have seen that Lego put some of their climate and sustainability goals into their employee bonus metrics. So if they're not meeting those goals, they're not getting their full bonus. That's one way to incentivize people to actually focus on this. And I think some other companies are doing this too, and I'm blanking on who they are. But that's where a strategic map can be a big lever, is if you actually build this stuff into the map itself. And same with risk assessment, right? Yeah, I think we're often too myopic about risk assessment and just think about sort of the short term. Can this company deliver materials in time, whereas it should also be very forward looking.
Yeah, great. And we have a little follow-up to Jack's question, and then we'll get to Teresa's question. So Jeff asked as a follow-up, he was wondering if you can elucidate the difference between an organization-wide LCA and doing materiality assessments, or the difference in application for these two tools, whether you're looking specifically at sourcing rather than operations-wide.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We conduct organization-wide LCAs, but we also sometimes call them a materiality assessment, although they are not the same as a traditional materiality assessment. The traditional materiality assessment, as many of you know, is based off of surveying a variety of stakeholders and functions about what they think is most important or which topics they think are most impactful for the organization. Whereas the LCA is using data on inputs and outputs, such as bill of materials and manufacturing, environmental, water, waste, and energy data, and a lot of data that you might keep in your ERP system. So what we really like, sometimes we see clients that have done a materiality assessment, a traditional one, and come to us and say, okay, we need more around how to set goals and strategy, and we'll do the enterprise level LCA. And it can help verify some of the things from the materiality assessment, but what we really like is that it's providing data instead of just what people might think. And sometimes there are surprises between the two. So that helps to focus it. And as far as the difference with sourcing, with the organization-wide LCA, of course, you are in life cycle assessment looking at the full life cycle, but you can zoom in on the sourcing side. And once you might look at the area, the hotspots that are coming out of that, we'll also work then to actually pull more supplier data through surveys or common tools that they're already using to better refine the model. So then we can actually look at differences between suppliers of the same materials or the same product types versus just having very high level secondary data. So you can actually get more primary data from your suppliers on like their energy grid, their technologies, to refine your model, and then understand, that's where you can get into more of the comparison between suppliers as well.
I have nothing to add there. That was great.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you. So Teresa asked, Jon specifically, actually, if you can expand on the reasons why companies do not leverage their purchasing power to drive sustainability outcomes.
Yeah, fortunately, I saw that question long enough that I got to jot down 3 ideas. So one, I think it's a lack of measurement, right? Most companies do not measure the sustainability performance of their suppliers directly. And so if you don't have data on where they were, where they are now, are they improving, are they not, it's really hard to put leverage on them. It's kind of like putting an employee on a performance improvement plan without actually telling them they're doing anything wrong first. Number two, I think it goes back to this point we just made about like, if sustainability metrics, goals, improvement are not tied directly to performance reviews and dollars of leadership in your company, then there's no real incentive for anyone in the company to actually pressure the suppliers to do this work. So I think it all goes back to that bigger picture of like, how does your company set its roadmap? Is there measurable sustainability metrics within it? I would argue there should be, and there should be some tied to the materials and the products you're buying. And then three, I think this is will not be a surprise to anybody, but just siloing, right? If the sustainability team, I mean, for everybody that is ever going to watch this recording, we might all be in completely separate parts of the organization. There's not a consistent reporting structure for sustainability. When I was at Anderson Windows, we reported up through sourcing, which was actually a really interesting place to be because we had a little bit more close relationship with those folks. But the sort of siloing idea of sourcing is going to take their cues from product development, not from sustainability. And if and only if there are metrics built in around sustainability, will they even pay attention to that? I think that's a really important one. So they're all sort of a similar problem in lack of measurement and lack of accountability at most organizations. And the ones that are exerting pressure on their suppliers, I would put money on probably have measurement and accountability built into their employee performance.
Great. All right. We have time for about 2 more questions. So you can either drop your questions in the chat or just come off mute and ask them directly.
I actually have a question for Olivia if no one else has one.
Sure.
Are you seeing, I think TrueNorth has been around for 5-6 years now. I don't even.
Actually, we're 3.5 years. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Are you seeing it just in that short time or in your time working in this space, are you seeing any sort of trends or advancements that you're excited about or alternatively not excited about? Are companies moving the needle here, or does it feel a little stagnant?
I do think companies are moving the needle, and I think a lot of honestly, it's interesting just to see the impact on regulations changing companies to think about this more. I work with one company that's very conservative in many aspects, and they're like, help us figure out what we need to do, and we know this is important. We also know it can be beneficial to business, but we just need to show the value aligned with what the business cares about, because I think traditionally sustainability has been seen as added cost and just nice to have, we're doing this for a good reason. But what we're trying to show is, all of the reasons that it can actually have the triple bottom line benefit of people, planet, profit. So it is interesting to see how some of the regulations are, I think, especially driving the companies that maybe wouldn't have had the leverage to give this more thought to do that, as well as the customer demand. And I mean, the surveys, while they're difficult for people to respond to, the surveys are definitely helping at least get the attention of many of our clients. I think now the difficulty is actually in executing this, but I have seen some of our clients actually invest in resources in procurement to help manage this. I think that's the best if they're showing they're able to bring folks in to support, because I just do feel especially those supply chain teams are just very overburdened already with a lot of work and keeping up, because there are so many just regulations too that they're dealing with in many different spaces. And so trying to help them figure out those top things they could really do to make a difference, I think is exciting for them too, because sometimes procurement can be a difficult field to be in when you are just trying to keep up with the general things. And also you're like, giving people slaps on the hand if they're not following what you need to, but instead, how do you create inspiration around what you can do and how it can be beneficial and you can collaborate? And I think I have seen some changes there. It's still evolving, of course, but even around the chemicals of concern, area, I think there's some really good work being done to work together between the customers and their suppliers.
Yeah, and the comment around regulation is really interesting because in my previous roles in corporate, I tried to look forward at regulation and get the company moving towards complying with future regulations before they happened, and that can be a really tricky exercise. They don't pay attention until their shirts are on fire. Yeah, that's an interesting one.
All right, and we'll end with Jeff's question.
Oh, well, thanks for ending with my question. Jon, great to see you. Olivia, nice to meet you. Thanks so much for the information. Learned a ton. My question actually, well, first reflecting on some of those final thoughts, like perfect connection with a lot of the stuff that's happening over in the EU around disclosure and reporting. So in terms of like looking forward to see what's coming our way, in addition to states that are progressive like California and Minnesota, looking at the EU. Jon, I know where you sit now with GreenBiz and circularity. My question is kind of mostly to you in terms of opportunities to engage and learn more at different conferences, whether it's GreenBiz conferences or others that you keep track of. Where do you see this sort of sustainable procurement topic popping up in the next 6-10 months?
It's a good question. There are some conferences, events, webinar series specifically devoted to sustainable procurement, and I'm going to forget them all right now. But I actually just did this exercise earlier this year because I was trying to figure out if there was any events that overlapped with mine, and I think I looked up like sustainable procurement events, and a bunch popped up. So I think when it comes to actual sourcing, there are some groups that are thinking about this, and they might be, industry sourcing groups that then have side events around sustainability, but I think that's still a step in the right direction. There are, man, I wish I knew, I wish I had a better answer here because it's most of the big events that I know of are sort of sector specific, right? So if you're in packaging, there's the Sustainable Packaging Coalition events that are great, and they talk about sourcing a lot. If you're in green buildings, there's Green Build and the International Living Futures Institute conference. Those are great and talk about sourcing, but there's not a lot of like broad cross-sector events and learning opportunities in this space. Although I would say when I was in the built environment, I learned the most from events that weren't dedicated to the built environment, right? If I was in a session around consumer technology, I'd often come out with like 3 or 4 nuggets of information that I could try to apply to my industry in a creative way. And that was often where we made the most progress. But yeah, it's a really good question that I don't have a good answer to at all.
Quick follow-up, where is the next circularity conference happening?
The next circularity conference is in Denver, Colorado, April 29th to May 1st, 2025. We just had our 2024 event last week. So
right. Well, maybe a little plug to think about sessions that would bring this group of folks together again.
Yeah, we definitely we had a few sessions this year that really focused on sourcing and as it relates to sourcing product design, because I think they really have to go hand in hand as we think about not only embodied carbon, but circular economy and regulatory concerns.
I mean, the comments that you guys both offered around, systems design and LCA obviously as a tool are quite pertinent in how we move forward collectively. Thanks.
Oh, and Olivia, good call out on the SPLC. That's the one I couldn't remember, actually.
Yep, I put the link in the chat for anyone that's interested in the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. And they have different kind of roundtable groups, whether you're a private company or public company, and they honestly on their portal for members, they have a lot of information on even like survey types or like examples of things. They have a discussion forum where you can post questions and get answers. So recommend checking that out if you want to get more into this space.
Yeah, and I know we have less than a minute left, so people are leaving, but I just really want to take one last minute to thank you both so much, Jon and Olivia, for sharing your expertise today, and to everyone who attended. I really appreciated hearing this conversation and had been really excited about it when we had our initial discussions. So I'm so happy that everyone was able to make it. And I do want to just do one quick plug that we also have our Environmental Initiative Awards coming up next week. And Rachel, who has been running our Zoom, is also the person to contact for this. So I just put that in the chat. Maybe we'll see you in person next week, but no matter what, I hope you all have great rest of your days. Thank you so much.
Thank
Everybody.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.